The moment my parents drained my $200,000 account, they thought they'd won, but what they didn't know was that I had already signed the paper that would lock every dollar they owned. My name is Evelyn Carter, I'm 31 years old, and 48 hours from now, my parents are going to lose access to over $5 million in assets they believe belong entirely to them, and the worst part is they still think I'm the one with nothing left. But this didn't start with the money disappearing, it started with a phone call I almost didn't answer, a random number flashing across my screen, while I was standing in line at a coffee shop on a quiet Tuesday morning, and if I had ignored it, maybe I would have had a few more hours before everything fell apart. Ms. Carter, this is First National Bank. We need to verify a series of transactions on your account. The tone was polite, neutral, practiced, the kind of voice that doesn't expect resistance because it assumes everything is routine. I remember stepping out of line, my coffee order half-spoken, my chest tightening in a way I couldn't explain yet. What transactions? I asked, already pulling up my banking app, already feeling that strange drop in my stomach like missing a step in the dark. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to matter. A total withdrawal of $198,430.72 processed over the last 36 hours. I didn't respond right away because I thought I had misheard her, because numbers like that don't just disappear without warning, because there should have been alerts, confirmations, something. My thumb hovered over the screen as the app loaded, and for a second, everything felt normal. Then the number appeared. Balance, $312.18. I stared at it, waiting for it to refresh, waiting for it to correct itself, like maybe it was a glitch or a delay or anything that made more sense than what I was looking at. But it didn't change. It just sat there. $312.18. Ma'am, are you still there? The voice asked gently. Yes, I said, though it came out quieter than I expected. Who authorized those transactions? Another pause. This one heavier. They were processed through an authorized secondary user on the account. I already knew the answer before she said it, but I asked anyway because part of me needed to hear it out loud, needed to make it real. And who is that? The response came without hesitation. Richard Carter and Susan Carter. My parents. Of course it was them. I don't remember hanging up the phone, but I remember the way the world around me kept moving like nothing had changed, people ordering coffee, laughing, checking their phones, while I stood there holding mine like it had just rewritten my entire life in a single screen. I wish I could say this was the first time something like this had happened, that this was some shocking betrayal that came out of nowhere, but the truth is it wasn't new, it was just bigger, cleaner, harder to ignore. Growing up, money in our family was never really mine, even when it had my name on it. I was the responsible one, the one who didn't need help, the one who could handle things, which was just a nicer way of saying I was the one they could take from without feeling guilty. I remember a dinner 3 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table while my mom waved her hand dismissively and said, "It's just money, Evelyn. Family comes first." At the time, it was about a smaller amount, a loan they promised to pay back, something that never quite returned but wasn't big enough to start a war over. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they would make it right. But standing there in that coffee shop, staring at a balance that barely covered groceries, I realized something I should have accepted a long time ago. They weren't borrowing. They were taking. And they never planned to give it back. I stepped outside into the cold air, my hands shaking just enough that I had to steady my phone against my palm to scroll through the transaction history. Transfer after transfer. Large amounts. Cleanly executed. No hesitation. No warning. Like they had been waiting for the moment to do it all at once. I opened my messages, already knowing what I'd find. There it was. A text from my father, sent 6 hours earlier. We needed to move some funds temporarily. We'll sort it out later. Don't overreact. Don't overreact. I read that line 3 times, each time feeling something inside me go quieter, not louder, not angrier, just quieter. Like a switch flipping from emotion to something colder, something more focused. Because it wasn't just the money. It was the certainty behind it. The assumption that I wouldn't fight back. That I couldn't. That I had no leverage. And for a moment, standing there with $312.18 to my name, and rent due in 2 days, it almost felt true. Almost. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have known when they drained my account so confidently, was that 2 years ago, after the last time they crossed a line and called it family, I had sat in a quiet office with a lawyer who looked me straight in the eye and said, "You have more control here than you think." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I just followed his advice, signed the documents, and filed them away, something practical, something preventative, something I hoped I'd never need. But now, as I stood there with the wind cutting through my coat, and my phone still in my hand, I realized exactly what he had been preparing me for. My parents thought they had emptied my account. What they didn't realize was that in doing so, they had just triggered something much bigger. And in less than 48 hours, they were going to find out exactly how much control I actually had. I did not go back inside the coffee shop after that call. I just stood on the sidewalk watching cars pass like I was waiting for something to make sense again, but nothing did. Not the numbers, not the message from my father, not the fact that they had managed to move almost $200,000 without a single conversation, and yet somehow still expected me to stay calm about it. I opened the transaction details again, slower this time, forcing myself to read every line instead of reacting to the total, because details mattered now in a way they never had before. Each transfer had been split carefully, structured just under internal alert thresholds, routed through accounts I recognized as theirs, and time-stamped across different hours of the day and night. This was not impulsive. This was planned. That realization settled in quietly, heavier than anger, heavier than shock. They had not taken the money because they were desperate. They had taken it because they believed they were entitled to it. I exhaled slowly and pulled up my mother's contact, staring at her name for a moment before pressing call. She answered on the second ring, her voice light, almost cheerful, like nothing unusual had happened. "Evelyn, I was just about to call you." Of course she was. "I saw the transfers," I said, keeping my tone even, controlled, the way you speak when you are trying not to give someone the reaction they expect. There was a brief pause, then a soft sigh, the kind that signals inconvenience rather than regret. "Yes, we moved some funds. Your father and I needed to cover a short-term gap. It is temporary." Temporary. The word landed flat. "You took almost everything in my account." "Evelyn," she said, her voice sharpening just slightly, "do not make this into something dramatic. It is family money. Family money. Not my savings. Not the result of 10 years of work, promotions, late nights, and careful planning. Family money." I closed my eyes for a second, feeling that same quiet shift inside me, the one that had started in the coffee shop, growing steadier now. "You did not ask." "We did not think we needed to," she replied, and that was it, the sentence that said everything without saying it directly. They did not think they needed my permission. I looked out at the street again, at a couple walking past holding hands, laughing about something small and ordinary, and I realized how far removed my definition of family had become from something like that. "When are you planning to return it?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "We will sort it out after the deal closes." "What deal?" I already knew she would not answer directly, but I needed to hear how she framed it. "Your father is finalizing a property acquisition. It is a timing issue. Once everything settles, we will balance things out." Balance things out. Not repay. Not return. Balance. I let the silence stretch for a moment, then said quietly, "I have rent due in 2 days." Her response came quickly, almost dismissive. "Use a credit card. You have always been good at figuring things out." There it was again. The role I had been assigned my entire life. The one who adapts. The one who absorbs. The one who does not cause problems. I felt something close to a laugh rise in my chest, but it never made it out. Of course, I said instead. I will figure it out. Good, she replied, her tone softening again, satisfied, as if the conversation had resolved exactly the way she expected. We will talk later. The line went dead before I could respond. I lowered the phone slowly, staring at my reflection in the dark screen for a second, trying to recognize the version of myself they still believed they were dealing with. Because the truth was, that version of me would have panicked. She would have scrambled to cover rent, shifted money around, adjusted her plans, waited patiently for repayment that might or might not come. She would have told herself it was temporary. She would have stayed small. But 2 years ago, something had changed. I turned and started walking, not back toward the coffee shop, not home, just moving because standing still suddenly felt like the wrong choice. My mind went back to that office, to the quiet confidence in the lawyer's voice, to the documents I had signed without fully realizing how much they would matter one day. At the time, it had felt like a precaution. Now it felt like a line drawn in advance, one I had just been pushed across. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone again, and this time I did not open my banking app or my messages. I scrolled to a different contact, one I had not needed to call in a long time, and pressed dial. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a familiar, steady voice answered. This is Daniel Brooks. I took a breath, feeling that quiet certainty settle into place. Daniel, it is Evelyn Carter, I said. I think it is time to activate the agreement. There was a brief pause on his end, not confusion, not hesitation, just recognition. I was wondering when you might say that, he replied calmly. And for the first time since I saw that balance drop to $312, I felt something shift back in my favor, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to know that what my parents had started was not going to end the way they expected. Daniel did not ask for details right away, which was exactly why I trusted him. He never reacted emotionally, never rushed, he just waited for the facts to line up before moving, and that steadiness was something I had learned to rely on 2 years ago when I first walked into his office not knowing exactly what I needed, only that something about my situation with my parents felt off in a way I could not ignore anymore. Tell me what happened, he said calmly, and I started walking again, slower this time, replaying everything in order, the bank call, the transactions, my mother's voice, the word temporary, the way she said family money like it erased ownership completely. When I finished, there was a brief silence on his end, the kind that meant he was already thinking 3 steps ahead. And they still have active access to your accounts, he asked. Not anymore, I replied, because that was the first thing I had done after hanging up with my mother. I had locked down everything on my end, passwords, permissions, every point of entry I could control, but it did not change what had already been taken. Good, he said. Then we proceed exactly as outlined. Exactly as outlined. The phrase sent me back to that day 2 years ago in a way that felt sharper now, clearer, like I was finally understanding a conversation I had only half grasped at the time. I had been sitting across from him in a quiet conference room, a stack of documents between us, my hands resting on the edge of the table as I tried to explain something that sounded smaller out loud than it felt in my chest. They do not see boundaries the same way I do, I had said back then, struggling to put it into precise terms. It is like anything I have is automatically theirs if they need it. Daniel had listened without interrupting, then asked a question that stayed with me long after that meeting ended. And what happens when they need more than you are willing to lose? I did not have an answer then. I do now. Evelyn, his voice pulled me back to the present, steady as ever. Once we activate the control clause, there is no partial effect. It is comprehensive. Are you prepared for that? I stopped walking for a moment, letting the weight of that question settle properly this time, because he was not talking about inconvenience or temporary tension, he was talking about a complete shift in leverage, a line that could not be uncrossed once I stepped over it. For most of my life, I had been the one adjusting, the one absorbing, the one making things easier for everyone else at my own expense, and part of me recognized that this would end that pattern permanently. Yes, I said, and my voice did not shake. I am prepared. There was a soft click on his end, the sound of a keyboard, papers moving, things being set into motion. Then we initiate phase 1 today, he said. You will receive confirmation within 24 hours, and full enforcement will follow shortly after. 24 hours. I glanced at the time on my phone, doing the math automatically, because timing suddenly mattered in a way it never had before. My parents believed they had solved their problem by taking my money. They believed they had bought themselves time. What they did not know was that time was about to become the one thing they did not have enough of. What happens on their side? I asked, not because I needed reassurance, but because I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand exactly what this would look like when it reached them. Initially, nothing visible, Daniel said. Then restrictions. Then holds. By the time they realize what is happening, the structure will already be in place. I nodded, even though he could not see me, because that matched exactly what I needed, not a confrontation, not a warning, but a system that moved quietly and locked into place before anyone had the chance to argue with it. And their current deal? I added, thinking back to what my mother had said about the property acquisition. There was a brief pause, then a measured response. If their liquidity depends on assets covered by the agreement, it will be impacted. Impacted. Another careful word, precise, controlled, but I understood what it meant in practical terms. Delays. Questions. Pressure. The kind of pressure my parents were not used to facing without control. Understood, I said. I will send you the updated authorization forms within the hour, he continued. Sign and return them, and we will proceed. I will, I replied. The call ended without anything dramatic, no final warning, no escalation, just a quiet agreement that something had shifted, and would continue shifting whether anyone else was ready for it or not. I lowered my phone again and stood there for a moment, feeling the difference in the air around me, not physically, but internally, like a balance that had been tilted for years was finally starting to level out. 2 hours ago, I was standing in a coffee shop staring at a number that made me feel like everything had been taken from me. Now, I was standing on the same street knowing that what had been taken was only part of the story, and the rest of it had not even begun to unfold yet. I started walking again, this time with a direction in mind, because there were still practical things to handle, rent, immediate expenses, the surface-level problems that still existed, but they no longer felt like the center of the situation. The center had shifted somewhere else entirely, to a set of documents, a legal structure, a decision I had made quietly 2 years ago that was about to become very loud in the lives of the people who never thought they needed my permission for anything. And as I reached into my bag to pull out my laptop and prepare the forms Daniel needed, one thought stayed steady in the back of my mind, not emotional, not reactive, just clear. They believed they had control. They were about to find out what it felt like to lose it. I spent the next hour at a small table in a quiet co-working space 3 blocks from my apartment, my laptop open, the authorization documents Daniel sent already waiting in my inbox, and for a moment I just stared at them without touching the keyboard because this was the exact point where intention became action, where something that had existed only as a precaution was about to become real. The subject line read simple and neutral, nothing that hinted at what it would actually do once signed, just a sequence of legal language that looked routine to anyone who did not understand the structure behind it. But I did now. Or at least, I understood enough. I clicked open the first file and read slowly, line by line, not because I needed to check the wording again, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it fully this time, to be sure that what I was about to do was not coming from anger or impulse but from clarity. Outside the window, people moved through their day like nothing had shifted, cars passing, someone walking a dog, a couple arguing quietly at the corner, ordinary moments continuing without interruption, and it struck me how contained this entire situation was, how something this significant could exist entirely inside a few documents and a decision no one else could see yet. My phone buzzed once on the table beside me, a new message lighting up the screen. My father. I did not open it right away. Instead, I finished reading the last page, scrolled back to the signature line, and placed my hands on the keyboard. 2 years ago, when Daniel first walked me through this structure, I remember hesitating, not because I did not trust him, but because part of me still believed I would never need it, that things would stay manageable, that my parents would eventually respect a boundary if I made it clear enough. He had watched that hesitation quietly, then said something that felt overly cautious at the time, but now echoed with precision. Preparation is not the same as escalation, he told me. It is simply choosing not to be unprotected. Back then, I nodded without fully understanding. Now, sitting in that chair with my account nearly empty, and their voices still echoing in my head, I understood exactly what he meant. I typed my name slowly, deliberately, each letter appearing on the screen like a confirmation of something that had already been decided long before this moment. Evelyn Carter. The cursor blinked once at the end of the line, waiting, and for a brief second I paused, not out of doubt, but out of recognition that this was the last quiet moment before everything began to shift. Then I clicked submit. The confirmation page loaded almost instantly, a simple message acknowledging receipt, nothing dramatic, nothing that reflected the scale of what had just been set in motion. But I felt it anyway, not as a surge of emotion, but as a steady grounding, like something aligning internally that had been off balance for years. My phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up and opened the message from my father. "We need to talk. Call me." No greeting. No explanation. Just urgency, sharp and direct. I glanced at the time stamp. Sent 10 minutes ago. He was already feeling something, maybe not the full picture yet, but enough to notice that things were not moving the way he expected. I set the phone back down without responding. For once, I was not the one reacting. I opened the second document Daniel had sent, the final authorization, and reviewed it with the same focus, confirming details, dates, the specific clauses that would trigger enforcement across their accounts and assets. It was all there, structured, precise, built to operate without emotion, without argument, without negotiation. That was the part my parents would not understand. They were used to conversations, to persuasion, to pushing until someone gave in. This was different. This did not respond to pressure. This did not adjust based on tone or insistence. It simply executed. I signed the second document and submitted it, watching the same confirmation appear, just as neutral as before, and for a moment the room felt very quiet, like the air had settled into a new configuration. I reached for my phone again, not to call my father but to check my email, and there it was, a new message from Daniel, sent less than a minute after my submission. Phase 1 initiated. You will receive system confirmation shortly. System confirmation. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting that phrase sit with me, because it meant that somewhere beyond this room, beyond what I could see directly, things were already beginning to move, flags being set, permissions shifting, access points narrowing in ways that would not be obvious immediately but would become impossible to ignore soon enough. My phone buzzed a third time, another message from my father, this one longer. I opened it. Evelyn, something is wrong with the accounts. Transactions are being delayed. Call me now. I read it once, then again, noting the change in tone, the absence of certainty, the first sign that control was slipping in a way he could not immediately fix. I did not feel satisfaction. I did not feel vindication. What I felt was something quieter, something steadier, like the balance I had been missing for so long was finally beginning to correct itself. I locked my phone, closed my laptop, and stood up from the table, gathering my things without rushing, because there was nothing left to do in this moment except let the structure I had activated do exactly what it was designed to do. As I walked toward the door, one thought stayed clear in my mind, not loud, not emotional, just certain. This time, I was not the one trying to catch up. This time, they were. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt sharper, colder than it had earlier, or maybe I was just more aware of it now, more aware of everything, the sounds of traffic, the rhythm of footsteps on the sidewalk, the quiet hum of a city that had no idea that somewhere inside a series of financial systems, something had already begun to unravel. My phone buzzed again before I even reached the corner, and this time it was not a message, it was a call. My father. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times, watching his name on the screen like it belonged to a different version of my life, One where I answered immediately, where I explained myself, where I tried to smooth things over before they escalated. That version of me did not exist anymore. On the fourth ring, I answered. Evelyn, his voice came through tight, controlled, but underneath it there was something new, something I had never heard from him before, uncertainty. What did you do? I kept walking, my pace steady, my voice even. I am not sure what you mean. There was a sharp exhale on the other end, the kind that usually came before he raised his voice, but he did not this time. He held it in. The accounts are restricted. Transfers are not clearing. The bank is flagging everything. This started after your call this morning. After my call. I almost corrected him, almost pointed out that this had started long before that, but I did not. There was no point in arguing timelines now. That sounds like something you should discuss with your bank, I said calmly. Silence. Then, slower, more deliberate. Evelyn, this is not the time for games. We are in the middle of closing a deal. We need liquidity. Whatever you did, reverse it. Reverse it. The word hung there heavy with expectation, as if this was just another situation where I would adjust, apologize, fix things for them because that was what I had always done. I reached the crosswalk and stopped, watching the light change from red to green, giving myself a moment before responding. You took my entire account, I said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. You said it was temporary, he replied quickly. And it is. We will return it once the deal closes. Once the deal closes. Always later. Always after something else mattered more. I stepped forward as the light changed, crossing the street with the rest of the crowd, blending into movement while the conversation stayed perfectly still. I needed that money now, I said. And I needed you to ask before taking it. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, the tone had shifted slightly, less controlled, more edged. We are your parents. We should not have to ask for access to family resources. There it was again. Family resources. Not mine. Not earned. Not separate. Just a pool they could draw from whenever it suited them. I reached the other side of the street and slowed my pace, turning slightly away from the flow of people so I could focus on his voice without distraction. You are right, I said quietly. You should not have to ask. Not if it truly belongs to you. The silence that followed was different this time, not just a pause, but a recalibration, like he was trying to understand what I meant, trying to find the angle that made sense of a response he did not expect. What is that supposed to mean? He asked. I could hear movement in the background now, papers shifting, a door closing, the environment around him no longer calm, no longer controlled. It means, I said evenly, that if something is yours, you can access it without interference. I let that sit for a second, then added, and if you cannot, then maybe it is not as simple as you thought. He did not respond immediately. I could almost picture him standing there, processing, connecting pieces that had not been connected before, realizing that whatever was happening was not a glitch, not a temporary delay, but something structured, something intentional. Evelyn, he said finally, his voice lower now, more careful, this is serious. There are multiple parties involved in this transaction. We cannot afford disruptions. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see me. Neither can I. The words came out softer than his, but they landed with a different kind of weight, not urgency, not pressure, just truth. There was a long silence after that, long enough that I wondered if he had ended the call, but then he spoke again, slower, measured. What do you want? It was the first real question he had asked, the first time the conversation had shifted away from commands and assumptions and into something closer to negotiation. But I did not answer right away. Instead, I thought about the past few hours, the bank call, my mother's dismissal, the way they had treated my money like it was already theirs, and I realized that this was not about asking for something in return. It was about something much simpler. I want what was mine to stay mine, I said. And I want you to understand that access is not the same as ownership. Another pause, quieter this time, less resistance in it. Then fix this, he said, but the edge was gone, replaced by something else, something closer to uncertainty. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. I did not break anything, I replied. I just stopped it from being taken again. And before he could respond, before the conversation could slide back into the patterns it had always followed, I ended the call, not out of anger, not out of defiance, but because for the first time in my life, I did not need to stay on the line to explain myself, and as my phone screen went dark in my hand, I knew that whatever happened next would not be something I had to chase or fix or absorb, it would be something they would have to face on their own. The rest of the afternoon passed in a strange kind of quiet, not the peaceful kind, but the kind where everything feels suspended just beneath the surface, like a storm that has not fully arrived yet but is already changing the pressure in the air. I went home, set my bag down by the door, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop closed in front of me, my phone resting beside it, both of them silent for the first time in hours. For a moment it almost felt like nothing was happening, like maybe everything would settle on its own, like maybe I had overestimated the impact of what I had just set in motion. But that thought did not last long. Because systems do not react immediately. They process. They verify. And then they enforce. At exactly 3:42 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with an email notification. Sender, First National Bank. Subject, Account Status Update. I opened it slowly, already knowing what I was about to read, but still needing to see it in writing. Due to updated authorization protocols, certain accounts associated with your profile have been placed under review and restriction. Please contact your financial representative for further details. The language was as neutral as always, careful, controlled, but I understood what it meant. The first layer had locked in. I set my phone down and leaned back slightly in my chair, exhaling slowly, not out of relief, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition. This was real now. Not theoretical. Not preventative. Real. The silence lasted less than 2 minutes. Then my phone lit up again. This time, it was my mother. I watched her name appear on the screen, the same way I had watched my father's earlier, but this felt different, sharper somehow, more immediate. I answered. Evelyn, her voice came through, and it was not calm anymore. It was tight, controlled, but strained underneath, like she was holding something back. What is going on? I did not rush to respond. I let the question sit there for a second, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted her to feel that pause, that shift, that absence of immediate reassurance she was used to getting from me. I am not sure what you are referring to, I said finally, my tone steady. There was a quick inhale on her end. Do not do that, she said, sharper now. We just got off the phone with the bank. They are saying there are restrictions on our accounts. On multiple accounts. They mentioned your name. There it was. Clear. Direct. No more guessing. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time automatically, because timing still mattered, because this was still unfolding step by step. That sounds like something they would explain to you, I replied. Evelyn, she said, my name stretched slightly, not in warmth but in warning. This is not a misunderstanding. This is affecting active transactions. Your father's deal is on hold because of this. We need you to fix it. We need you to fix it. The same pattern. The same expectation. Just with higher stakes now. I rested my elbow on the table, leaning slightly forward, my voice lowering just enough to match the seriousness of hers without mirroring the urgency. You took money from my account without asking, I said. You said it was temporary. So this is temporary too. There was a brief silence, then a shift in her tone, something more calculated now, less sharp, more controlled. Evelyn, listen to me, she said, softer but firmer. This is not the same thing. What you are doing is interfering with financial structures you do not fully understand. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. The assumption that I did not understand. That I could not possibly be operating with the same level of awareness they were. I understand enough, I said calmly. I understand that access is not the same as ownership. And I understand that you assumed I would not use the control I have. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing, could hear the subtle shift as she recalculated, as she realized this was not going to resolve with a simple conversation. You are overreacting, she said finally, but the confidence was thinner now, less certain. We have always shared resources as a family. Always shared. I let that phrase sit for a moment, then answered quietly. Shared implies consent. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, not just a pause, but a recognition, an understanding that something fundamental had changed in the way this conversation worked, in the way I responded, in the way I existed within the structure they had always controlled. What do you want us to do? She asked finally, and the question landed differently coming from her than it had from my father, less direct, more careful, but still unmistakably a shift. For the first time, she was not telling me what would happen. She was asking. I looked down at my phone, at her name on the screen, at the reflection of my own face in the dark edges of the display, and I realized that this was not about demands or conditions or negotiations. It was about something much simpler. I want you to understand that I am not your backup plan, I said. I am not your emergency fund. And I am not something you can access without consequence. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The words carried enough weight on their own. On the other end of the line, she did not respond right away, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us like a space that had finally been acknowledged instead of ignored. And then, quietly, almost carefully, she said, Evelyn, this is going to have serious consequences. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it. I know, I replied. That is the point. After I ended the call with my mother, the apartment felt quieter than it had all day, but it was not the kind of quiet that brings relief. It was the kind that settles in after something irreversible has already been set in motion, like a door that has closed and will not open the same way again. I stayed at the table for a few minutes, my hands resting flat against the surface, feeling the faint texture of the wood under my palms, grounding myself in something physical while everything else continued shifting somewhere I could not see. Then my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time. A series of notifications, one after another, stacking faster than I could read them at a glance. Emails. Alerts. System updates. I picked up the phone and opened the first one. Another message from First National Bank. Additional restrictions have been applied to associated accounts pending further review. I opened the next. Transaction attempt declined. Then another. Asset access temporarily suspended. Each message was written in the same neutral tone, the same controlled language, but together they formed a pattern that was no longer subtle. The second layer had engaged. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair, letting the sequence play out without interrupting it, because there was nothing to manage here, nothing to respond to, just a system executing exactly as it was designed to do. My phone rang again. This time, it was not either of my parents. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was theirs. I answered. Hello. There was a brief pause, then a professional voice, measured and precise. Ms. Carter, this is Andrew Collins from Collins and Reeves Financial. I represent your parents in several ongoing transactions. I was hoping to speak with you regarding some recent account restrictions. Of course. It had escalated beyond family now. It had reached representation. I stood up from the table and walked toward the window, looking out over the street below as I responded. What can I help you with? I asked, my tone calm, neutral, matching his. We are currently experiencing significant delays in a property acquisition valued at approximately $5 million, he said. The issue appears to be linked to authorization controls associated with your name. We would like to understand the nature of these restrictions and how they might be resolved quickly. Quickly. Always quickly when it was their timeline. I rested my hand lightly against the glass, watching a car pass below, its movement smooth, uninterrupted, unlike everything else connected to this situation. The restrictions are not accidental, I said. They are part of an existing legal structure. There was a brief silence on his end, not surprise, but recalculation, the kind that happens when a situation is more complex than initially presented. I see, he replied. Then perhaps we can discuss a pathway to restore functionality. Our clients are prepared to address any concerns you may have. Address any concerns. The phrasing was careful, diplomatic, but underneath it was the same assumption, that this could be resolved with the right conversation, the right adjustment, the right offer. I turned slightly, leaning back against the wall, my voice steady. This is not a matter of concerns, I said. It is a matter of boundaries that were not respected. Another pause. Longer this time. Understood, he said finally. However, the current situation is affecting multiple parties beyond your immediate family. There are contractual obligations in place. Delays could result in financial penalties. Penalties. Consequences. The language was shifting now, expanding outward, pulling in external pressure, external stakes, as if that would change the structure that had already been activated. That is something your clients should have considered before accessing funds that were not theirs, I replied. My tone did not change. It did not need to. On the other end, I could hear him adjusting his approach, his voice becoming more formal, more direct. Ms. Carter, I would strongly recommend that we find a resolution that minimizes disruption for all involved parties. I closed my eyes for a second, not out of frustration but out of clarity because this was the moment where the situation could have slipped back into negotiation, into compromise, into the same patterns that had defined it for years. But I did not step into that space. The resolution is already in place, I said. It is functioning exactly as intended. Silence. Not just a pause but a recognition, the moment where he understood that this was not a misunderstanding, not an error, not something that could be adjusted with a conversation. Then I will advise my clients accordingly, he said finally, his tone controlled but tighter now, the professional distance still there but no longer as confident. Thank you for your time. The line disconnected. I lowered the phone slowly, the room returning to that same quiet as before, but it felt different now, fuller, heavier with everything that had been set in motion beyond these walls. I walked back to the table and sat down again, my gaze drifting briefly to my laptop, still closed, still resting where I had left it, a small, ordinary object that had just become the starting point for something much larger. Somewhere across the city, my parents were dealing with calls like that, messages like the ones on my phone, systems they could not override, processes they could not rush, and for the first time, they were the ones trying to understand a structure they did not control. I did not feel the need to check my messages again. I already knew what they would say. What mattered now was not the volume of their responses, but the direction of everything that had already begun to move. And as I sat there, letting the silence settle again, one thought stayed steady in my mind, clear and unshaken. This was only the beginning of what they were about to lose. That night, I did not turn on the television, I did not open my laptop again, I did not try to distract myself with anything external, because there was nothing left to distract from, everything that mattered was already in motion. Unfolding in systems and conversations I could not see, but could feel in the steady rhythm of notifications that continued to arrive on my phone like distant echoes of something larger taking shape. Around 7:18 in the evening, another message came through, this time not from the bank, not from a lawyer, but from my father. Again, and the tone had changed in a way that was impossible to ignore. Evelyn, we need to handle this in person. This is getting out of control. I read it once, then again, noting the shift from authority to urgency, from instruction to request, and for a moment I just held the phone in my hand without responding, letting the weight of that change settle in fully. Out of control. That was the phrase he chose. Not unfair. Not inappropriate. Not wrong. Out of control. As if control had always belonged to them, and anything outside of that was automatically a problem that needed to be corrected. I set the phone down on the table and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, the simple motion grounding me again in something immediate, something unaffected by everything else happening around it. When I came back, there was another message. We are meeting with the bank at 9 a.m. tomorrow. You need to be there. Need. Not asked. Not invited. Still framed as a requirement. I sat down slowly, looking at the two messages side by side, the tension between them almost visible, urgency layered over expectation, pressure wrapped in familiarity. I did not respond right away. Instead, my mind drifted back to a moment years ago, something small at the time, but clearer now in hindsight. I was 23, just starting my first full-time job, proud of my independence in a way that felt new and fragile, and I remember sitting at the same kind of table, a different apartment, a different version of myself, as my father explained why it made sense for me to add them to my account. It is just for convenience, he had said. In case something happens. It is easier if we can access things directly. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Responsible, even. I had not yet learned the difference between access and control. I had not yet learned that convenience for one person can become entitlement for another if boundaries are not clearly defined. I picked up my phone again, not to respond to my father but to check the time. 7:26 p.m. 12 hours until that meeting he expected me to attend. 12 hours until they would sit across from bankers and advisors trying to understand why something that had always worked in their favor was suddenly working against them. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Daniel. A short message. Phase 2 is fully active. Expect escalation overnight. I read it carefully twice, letting the words settle into place, because escalation meant the next layer, the one that moved beyond restrictions and into consequences that could not be ignored or delayed. I typed back a simple response. Understood. Then I set the phone down again, leaning back in my chair, my gaze drifting toward the window where the city lights had started to come on, one by one, steady and predictable, unlike everything else unfolding beneath them. For a moment I considered what tomorrow would look like, the meeting, the conversations, the way my parents would present the situation, the way they would try to frame it as a misunderstanding, something technical, something that could be resolved quickly if the right person just stepped in and fixed it. And for the first time, I saw that scenario from the outside instead of from within it, saw the assumptions built into it, the expectation that I would show up, that I would cooperate, that I would restore things to the way they had been. But the way things had been was exactly the problem. My phone buzzed again, another message from my father, shorter this time. Do not make this worse than it already is. I let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because there was nothing humorous about it, just a familiar pattern repeating itself one more time, the idea that the situation was escalating because of my actions, not because of what had led to them. I picked up the phone and finally typed a response. I will not be at the meeting. I watched the message send, the small indicator confirming delivery, and then I set the phone down again without waiting for a reply. Because this was not a discussion anymore. This was not something that needed my presence to move forward. It was already moving. And as the minutes passed and the notifications slowed slightly, not stopping, but spacing out just enough to feel like the system was settling into its next phase, one thought stayed clear in my mind, steady and unshaken. By the time they walked into that bank tomorrow morning, everything would already be decided. They just did not know it yet. I woke up before my alarm the next morning, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had never fully shut down. It had just slowed enough for my body to rest while everything else kept moving beneath the surface, like a system running in the background that does not need your attention to continue executing. The first thing I did was reach for my phone, not out of habit but out of expectation, because I already knew there would be updates waiting. There were 12 notifications. Emails, missed calls, messages, all time stamped between 5:12 a.m. and 7:03 a.m., a steady escalation that had not paused overnight the way normal problems do. I opened the first email. Subject: Immediate action required. Another from the bank, but this one was different, the language still controlled but sharper, more definitive. Due to compliance enforcement tied to ownership verification protocols, multiple assets have been placed under administrative hold. No transactions will be processed until review is complete. Administrative hold. I read that phrase twice, letting it settle, because this was the layer Daniel had warned about, the one that moved beyond temporary restriction into something that could not be bypassed with a call, or a meeting, or a sense of urgency. I opened the next email. Pending transaction delayed. Required funds unavailable. Then another. Contractual review triggered due to asset restriction. Each message was a piece of the same structure locking into place, one after another, without hesitation, without negotiation. I set the phone down for a moment and sat up in bed, the room quiet, the morning light just beginning to come through the window, and for the first time since this started, I felt the full weight of the shift, not as tension, but as certainty. Somewhere across the city, my parents were waking up to this same sequence, the same notifications, the same language, but without the context I had, without the understanding of what had already been set in motion. My phone rang before I could reach for it again. My father. I let it ring once, then answered. Where are you? There was no greeting, no transition, just the question, immediate and sharp, but underneath it, something else, something closer to urgency than authority. At home, I replied. There was a brief pause, then his voice again, tighter now. The bank is asking for clarification on ownership structures tied to multiple accounts. They are referencing documents we have never seen before. I stood up slowly, walking toward the window, looking down at the street where people were already moving through their morning routines, unaware of how differently this day was unfolding for me compared to them. That sounds like something they would explain during your meeting, I said calmly. We are at the meeting, he replied, and I could hear it now, the background noise, low voices, the faint echo of a large room, the sound of chairs moving, papers being handled, the environment controlled but no longer comfortable. Then you should have all the information you need, I said. There was a pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, the tone had shifted again, not just urgency now but pressure. They are saying certain assets cannot be accessed without your authorization. That you are listed as a controlling party. Controlling party. Hearing the words out loud, not from Daniel, not from a document, but from my father, felt different, heavier, like something abstract had just become real in a way he could not ignore. I leaned my shoulder lightly against the wall, my voice steady. That is correct. Silence. Not just a pause, but a break in the pattern, the moment where the structure he understood stopped applying and something else took its place. That is not possible, he said finally, but the certainty was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain. We structured everything through our accounts. I closed my eyes for a second, not out of frustration, but out of clarity, because this was the exact assumption Daniel had prepared me for, the belief that control comes from visibility, from whose name appears where, from who moves the money. You structured access, I said quietly. Not ownership. I could hear movement on his end, voices closer now, someone speaking to him directly, but I could not make out the words, only the shift in his breathing as he listened, processed, tried to reconcile what he was being told with what he believed to be true. Evelyn, he said again, his voice lower now, more controlled, but also more careful, they are saying that without your approval, these assets remain frozen. Do you understand what that means? I looked out the window again, at the steady flow of people and cars and everything continuing as normal, and for a moment, I thought about how simple that question sounded, how obvious the answer should have been. Yes, I said. I understand exactly what it means. There was another pause, and this one felt different, heavier, like something had just shifted into place on his end, not fully understood yet, but recognized enough to change the way he was speaking. Then approve it, he said, but it was not a command anymore, not quite, it was closer to a request wrapped in familiarity. I did not answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, not as a tactic, not as a punishment, but because for the first time, the timing of my response actually mattered more than the words themselves. "You took what was mine without asking," I said finally. "Now you need what is yours, and you need my permission to access it." I let that sit for a moment, then added, "That is what this means." On the other end of the line, he did not respond immediately, and for a moment, all I could hear was the faint noise of the room he was in, the quiet tension of a conversation happening around him that he could no longer control on his own. And as I stood there, phone in my hand, watching the city move forward like nothing had changed, one thing became completely clear. This was no longer about money. This was about who actually had the power to decide what happened next. There was a shift in the silence after I said it, not something loud or obvious, but something subtle that changed the direction of the conversation entirely, like a line had been crossed that neither of us could pretend was not there anymore. On the other end of the call, I could still hear the room around my father, low voices, the faint echo of a professional space where people were used to control, used to certainty, used to deals moving forward exactly as planned, and now that rhythm had been interrupted in a way that none of them could immediately fix. "Evelyn," he said again, and this time my name sounded different, not just urgent, not just controlled, but measured, like he was choosing each word more carefully than before. "This is not just about us. There are contracts involved. Timelines. If this deal collapses, the financial impact will extend far beyond this conversation." I listened without interrupting, because I understood what he was doing, expanding the scope, introducing external consequences, trying to reframe the situation as something bigger than the two of us, something that required cooperation rather than accountability. But the structure he was describing was exactly the one that had allowed this pattern to exist in the first place, the idea that urgency somewhere else always outweighed what had been taken from me here. "You should have considered that before you moved money that was not yours," I said calmly. There was a pause, and I could hear someone speaking to him again in the background, more clearly this time, a voice asking a question, another responding, the conversation around him tightening as the reality of the situation became harder to contain. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted once more, not softer, not exactly, but more direct, more focused. "What do you need to release the hold?" There it was again, the same question from earlier, but now with more weight behind it, more urgency, more recognition that this was no longer something that could be dismissed or delayed. I leaned slightly against the wall, my gaze still fixed on the street below, watching a delivery truck pull up to the curb, the driver stepping out, moving with purpose, unaware of how differently time was moving for the people in that meeting across the city. "This is not a transaction," I said. "It is not something you can balance out after the fact." He did not respond right away, and for a moment, the only sound between us was the quiet noise of the environment around him, the subtle tension of professionals waiting for clarity that he could not yet provide. "Then what is it?" he asked finally, and the question was different this time, less controlled, less strategic, more genuine in a way I had not heard from him before. I let the silence stretch for a second, not to create pressure, but to allow the answer to land the way it needed to. "It is a boundary," I said. "One that should have been there a long time ago." There was a longer pause after that, and when he spoke again, the edge was gone, replaced by something else, something quieter, something closer to recognition. "We did not think," he started, then stopped, the sentence trailing off like he was realizing halfway through that whatever he was about to say no longer applied. I did not fill the silence for him. I let it sit there because for the first time, it was not my responsibility to make the conversation easier, to guide it, to soften it. After a few seconds, he tried again. "We assumed it would not be an issue," he said. Assumed. That word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, because it was honest in a way the others had not been. It acknowledged the foundation of everything that had led to this moment, the belief that I would always adapt, always absorb, always make room for their decisions no matter how they were made. "That assumption is the problem," I replied quietly. Another pause. Then, from his end, a different voice, closer now, more direct, someone speaking to him in a lower tone, but close enough that I could hear the urgency even if I could not make out every word. There was a brief exchange, then the sound of movement, like he had stepped away from the table, creating space between himself and the others. When he came back on the line, his voice was different again, not just measured, but careful in a way that suggested he was fully aware now of what was at stake. "Evelyn," he said, "they are asking for a timeline. They need to know when this can be resolved." I closed my eyes for a second, letting that question settle, because it was not just about time, it was about control, about who determined when something ended, who decided when access was restored, who set the conditions for moving forward. And for the first time, the answer to that question was not his to give. "It will be resolved when the structure allows it," I said. "Not before." The silence that followed was absolute, no background noise, no shifting voices, just a moment where everything seemed to pause completely, like even the room he was in had stopped moving for a second as the implication of that answer settled in. When he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, but undeniably changed. "You are serious about this," he said. It was not a question. I opened my eyes and looked out at the city again, at the steady, uninterrupted motion of everything outside, and I realized that what I felt was not anger, not resentment, not even satisfaction. It was something much simpler. It was certainty. "Yes," I said. "I am." And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever consequences unfolded from here, the balance that had shifted was not going to return to what it had been before, because for the first time, I was not reacting to their decisions. I was defining them. For a moment after I said it, neither of us spoke, and the silence felt different from all the ones before, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, like something had finally reached its natural conclusion without needing to be pushed any further. On the other end of the line, I could still hear the faint presence of the room around him, but it was quieter now, more contained, as if whatever conversation had been happening there had shifted in response to what I had just said. "Evelyn," he said after a few seconds, and this time there was no edge, no urgency, just a controlled calm that felt unfamiliar coming from him. "They are asking if you are willing to attend a follow-up meeting. With legal present." Legal present. The structure was evolving again, moving from assumption to negotiation, from expectation to formality. I leaned slightly against the wall, my fingers resting loosely around my phone, considering the question not as a demand, but as an option, something I could choose rather than something I was required to accept. "No," I said simply. There was a pause, but not the kind that carried resistance. More like acknowledgement. "Then they will proceed without you," he replied. "They are reviewing all documentation tied to your name." I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it, because that was exactly what needed to happen, not a conversation, not a confrontation, but a review, something structured, something that operated independently of anyone's expectations. "That is appropriate," I said. Another silence followed, but this one was quieter, less charged, like the energy of the conversation had shifted away from urgency and into something more measured, more deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I could not ignore, not dramatically, not emotionally, but in a way that suggested something had settled. Internally for him as well. "You planned this," he said. Not an accusation. Not even a question. Just a statement. I let out a slow breath, thinking back to that office 2 years ago, to the documents, the conversations, the careful explanations I had only half understood at the time. "I prepared for it," I replied. "There is a difference." He did not respond immediately, and I could almost feel him considering that distinction, turning it over, recognizing what it meant without needing it explained further. "We never thought it would come to this," he said finally, and this time the honesty in his voice was clearer than anything else he had said so far, not defensive, not dismissive, just real in a way I had not heard before. I looked out the window again, at the steady movement of the city, the same rhythm that had continued unchanged while everything else shifted beneath it, and I realized that what he was saying was true. They had never thought it would come to this. Because for them, it never had. "That is exactly why it did," I said quietly. The silence that followed was not heavy this time, not tense, just present, like both of us were standing on opposite sides of something that had finally been defined clearly enough that neither of us needed to fill the space with explanations anymore. After a few seconds, he spoke again, slower now, more deliberate. The bank is saying that if this is not resolved within 48 hours, the deal will collapse, he said. There are penalty clauses. Reputational consequences. I listened, understanding the weight of those words, the implications, the ripple effect that extended far beyond a single transaction, but also recognizing that those consequences had been built into the system long before this moment, long before my involvement became necessary. That timeline does not change anything on my end, I said. He exhaled quietly, not in frustration, not exactly, but in acknowledgement, like he understood that pushing further would not shift the outcome. Then I need to ask you something directly, he said. Are you willing to release control at any point? The question was clear, stripped of everything else, no framing, no context, just the core of what this had become. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I thought about everything that had led here, the years of small adjustments, the moments where I had chosen to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to maintain something that only worked if I continued to give more than I received. And I realized that this was not a question about timing. It was a question about change. I am willing to release control when the structure reflects reality, I said. Not assumption. There was a pause after that, and this one felt final in a way the others had not, like the conversation had reached a point where there was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to clarify. When he spoke again, his voice was steady, but different, not in tone, but in weight. Then we will proceed accordingly, he said. And that was it. No argument. No escalation. Just acceptance of a reality that had shifted beyond his ability to redirect it. The call ended a second later, the line going quiet in a way that felt complete rather than abrupt, and I lowered my phone slowly, letting the silence settle around me again. For the first time since this began, there were no immediate follow-up messages, no new notifications, just a stillness that felt deliberate, like everything that needed to be set in motion already had been. I walked back to the table and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the surface, the same position I had been in hours earlier, but with everything fundamentally different now. Somewhere across the city, meetings were continuing, documents were being reviewed, decisions were being made without my presence, and for the first time, that did not feel like a loss of control. It felt like exactly the opposite. And as I sat there, letting that realization settle fully, one thought stayed clear, steady, and unshaken. They were no longer deciding what happened next. I was. The rest of the day unfolded without noise, without sudden calls or urgent messages, and that silence felt more significant than anything that had come before it, because it meant the situation had moved beyond reaction and into resolution, the kind that happens behind closed doors, inside conversations I was no longer part of, inside systems that did not require my presence to continue. By early afternoon, the notifications had stopped completely, no new emails, no missed calls, no attempts to reach me, and that absence told me more than anything they could have said. Directly. They were no longer trying to convince me. They were trying to adapt to a reality they had not planned for. Around 2:17 p.m., my phone buzzed once, a single message, not from my parents, not from the bank but from Daniel. Phase 3 completed. Await final confirmation. I read it carefully, letting each word settle, because this was the last stage he had mentioned, the one that moved beyond enforcement into final positioning, where everything that had been restricted, reviewed, and challenged was now defined clearly within the structure we had activated. I set my phone down and stood up from the table, walking slowly toward the window again, the same place I had stood so many times over the past 24 hours, but everything felt different now, not because the world outside had changed, but because the pressure inside this situation had shifted completely. Somewhere across the city, my parents were no longer trying to reverse what had happened. They were trying to understand what was left. That realization settled quietly, without emotion, just clarity. At 3:02 p.m., my phone buzzed again. This time, it was my mother. I watched her name appear on the screen, the same way I had before, but something about it felt different now, not urgent, not sharp, just contained. I answered. Evelyn, she said, and her voice was steady, not strained, not sharp, but measured in a way I had never heard before. We spoke with the bank. And with legal. I did not respond right away. I let her continue. They explained the structure, she said. The ownership alignment. The control provisions. There was a brief pause, then a quieter addition. We did not realize how it was set up. I leaned lightly against the wall, listening, because this was not a defense, not a justification, just an acknowledgement, something that had been missing from every conversation before this. It was set up that way for a reason, I replied calmly. Yes, she said, and the word came out softer than anything else she had said so far. We understand that now. The silence that followed was not heavy. It was not tense. It was something else entirely, something closer to recognition, like both of us were standing in the same reality for the first time, instead of arguing from two different ones. The deal is off, she said. After a moment. They cannot proceed without access to those assets. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see it, because that outcome had been inevitable the moment phase 2 locked in, the moment liquidity became restricted, the moment time and control stopped aligning in their favor. There will be penalties, she added, her voice steady but quieter now. Financial loss. Reputation damage. I did not respond immediately. Not because I did not understand, but because I did, completely, and I also understood something else, something that had been missing from every previous conversation. Consequences had always existed. They had just never applied to them before. I am aware, I said finally. There was another pause, longer this time, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed again, not dramatically, but in a way that felt more honest than anything else she had said so far. We should not have taken your money without asking, she said. The sentence landed quietly, without emphasis, without defense, just a statement of fact. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of relief, not out of satisfaction, but because hearing it said out loud mattered in a way I had not expected. No, I replied softly. You should not have. The silence that followed was different again, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just present, like something that had been unresolved for years had finally been acknowledged in the simplest possible terms. What happens now? She asked, and the question was not framed as a demand, not as a negotiation, just a genuine uncertainty about what came next. I opened my eyes and looked out at the city again, the same steady movement, the same rhythm that had continued through everything, and I realized that the answer to that question was not complicated. It was not hidden inside legal language or financial structures. It was simple. Now things stay where they belong, I said. What is mine stays mine. What is yours stays yours. There was a pause, then a quiet response. And the restrictions, she asked. I considered that for a moment, not because I needed to decide, but because I wanted the answer to be clear, not reactive, not emotional, just grounded in what had already been established. They will be adjusted, I said. But not removed entirely. Another pause. Why not? She asked. I let out a slow breath, my voice steady. Because access without boundaries is what caused this in the first place. There was no immediate response, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, but this silence felt different from all the others, not like something was missing, but like everything that needed to be said already had been. And as I stood there, phone in hand, looking out at a world that had continued unchanged while everything else shifted beneath it, one thought stayed clear and settled in a way it had not before. This was not about taking anything from them. It never had been. It was about making sure they could not take from me again. The apartment felt different after that call, not quieter, not louder, just settled, like something that had been out of place for years had finally shifted back into alignment without needing to be forced. I set my phone down on the table and walked slowly toward the window one last time, looking out over the city as the late afternoon light stretched across the buildings, everything moving forward in its usual rhythm, unchanged by everything that had just happened. Somewhere across the city, my parents were adjusting to a new reality, one where access was no longer automatic, where control had limits, where assumptions no longer held the same weight they once did. And for the first time, I was not thinking about what they would do next, not anticipating their response, not preparing myself to adapt. I was just standing there, present in a moment that felt complete. Later that evening, another message came through, short and simple. My father. We have returned the full amount. Check your account. I did not rush to open the app. I did not need to. The urgency that had defined the last 24 hours was gone, replaced by something steadier, something that did not depend on immediate confirmation. When I finally checked, the balance had been restored, every dollar accounted for, every transfer reversed, not because I had demanded it, not because I had argued for it, but because for the first time, they understood that they no longer had the option not to. I set the phone down again and exhaled slowly, not in relief, not in victory, just in recognition of what had changed. This was never about winning. It was about balance. Over the next few days, things continued to adjust quietly. The restrictions shifted into structured oversight, access points redefined, permissions no longer assumed but clearly outlined. Conversations became shorter, more careful, less about expectation and more about clarity. There were no dramatic apologies, no sudden transformations, just small, deliberate changes in the way things were handled, the way I was addressed, the way boundaries were acknowledged instead of ignored. And strangely, that was enough. Because what mattered was not what they said. It was what they stopped doing. One evening, about a week later, my mother called again, her voice calm, measured, familiar but different in a way that was hard to define. We are reviewing everything, she said. Making sure things are structured correctly moving forward. I listened, recognizing the shift not just in her words, but in her understanding, the quiet acceptance that things were no longer the way they had been. That is good, I replied. And that was it. No tension. No argument. Just a conversation that existed without the weight it used to carry. After the call ended, I sat at the same table where everything had started, my hands resting lightly on the surface, the same position, the same space, but with a completely different sense of presence. For most of my life, I had believed that keeping peace meant giving more, adjusting more, staying quiet longer than I should have. I thought that was what made relationships work. But what I understand now is that peace built on imbalance is not peace at all. It is just silence waiting to break. Real balance does not come from sacrifice that is never acknowledged. It comes from boundaries that are respected on both sides. And sometimes, the only way to create that balance is to stop allowing what should never have been allowed in the first place. What happened was not about punishment. It was not about proving a point or taking something back. It was about redefining what was acceptable, about making it clear that love and family do not give anyone the right to take without asking, to assume without understanding, to cross lines without consequence. Because the truth is, relationships are not defined by how much you can give without breaking. They are defined by how well both sides respect what should never be taken at all. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do for yourself and even for the people around you, is to draw a line not out of anger, but out of clarity, and to stand there without stepping back. Not because you want distance, but because you finally understand your own value. And once you see that clearly, everything else has no choice but to adjust.